Happy New Year, everyone. Isn't this the perfect time for this lecture? I mean, December came with the 3 F's, was family, friends, and what's the last one? Food, okay, and New Year's. And so now we've made our New Year's resolutions. Let's not call them resolutions, we'll call them permanent and positive lifestyle changes, right? And tonight, this lecture is going to help. My name is Lisa Sakia. I'm with Corporate Communications here at the Queens Health Systems. And on behalf of Queens, I welcome you all this evening. Tonight's lecture is called The Psychology of Eating, the Keys to Successful Weight Management. It is my pleasure and privilege to introduce our two speakers for this evening. They're both from the Comprehensive Weight Management Program. You saw the information table out there. You know, they've helped hundreds of people lose weight, and it's really a team of people. So it's not just doctors, it's people like psychologists and registered dietitians. So tonight, the first guest we have that I'm going to introduce you to is Dr. Ronnie Sato. Let's give her a warm round of applause. She is the lead psychologist at the Comprehensive Weight Management Program. She graduated from the University of Hawaii at Manoa with a BA in psychology. She received her doctorate of psychology in clinical psychology at Argosy University. She did her postdoctoral fellowship at the Kapi'olani Child Protection Center. She is a licensed clinical psychologist. She is a member of the American Psychological Association and also a member of the American Society for Metabolic and Bariatric Surgery. Our next guest for this evening is Connie Wang. She is a registered dietitian, and she received her Bachelor's of Science degree at the University of Texas in Austin. She did a dietetic internship at Sodexo Distance Education. She is registered by the Commission on Dietetic Registration, and she is affiliated with the Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics and the Hawaii Dietetic Association. We're going to start with Dr. Sato.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us tonight and venturing out through this bad weather. Tonight we're going to be talking about the psychology of eating and, of course, the keys to successful weight management. So our agenda for this evening is going to be that we're going to give a little definition of the psychology of eating. We're going to talk about our relationship with food, some strategies for behavioral changes, and then Connie's going to go over the different types of hunger and strategies to manage hunger. So first thing that we want to talk about is, what is the psychology of eating? So it's the cognitive and emotional factors that contribute to our eating habits. And so basically what that means is the things that we think and feel influence how we eat. And so we can kind of think of it as a spectrum from healthy eating to unhealthy eating. And healthy eating, of course, is going to be motivated by things like nutrition, the desire to manage your weight, and ultimately to have your food sort of be protective of your health. Unhealthy eating can be associated more with pleasurable eating, so things that you want to eat. It can also be motivated by things like emotions and stress. Sometimes it can also be access to food, healthy choices. In this day and age, we live in a world of fast food, and so that can be one of the factors. And of course, finally, we want to also make sure that we talk about sort of the unrealistic expectations, because there are, things in the media that influence how we think we should look, and that's going to influence our eating habits. Let me see if I can use this. Oh, yes, okay. So the first thing that we want to look at is, how did we start to develop our, our understanding and our relationship with food? So it really starts at a very young age. We learn quite early on that food is something that can be comforting. So as an infant, we don't have a context of what eating or food is. All we know is that we have a discomfort in our body, and then someone comes along and gives us milk or formula, and we find that, wow, that took away the bad feeling. And so that's our first sort of relationship with food. And through our development, we start to develop preferences But along the way, we're also socializing or associating our foods with different emotions. So for example, happy times when there's birthday cakes or parties, those kinds of emotions get paired with the foods that we're having. Same thing in our local culture, lots of parties with foods, and that's something that gets paired with the emotions that come along with that. So those are not necessarily bad things for us to have this sort of, happy context of food, but there are times where it becomes unhealthy and we start to think of it in terms of maladaptive eating. And so how we know that eating has become maladaptive is when we start to use food to cope with unwanted emotions, for example. Foods can also become a sort of replacement for other sort of coping mechanisms like drugs and alcohol. And so that's another way that it can become very unhealthy. We also think about how food sort of affects us when we have medical conditions. So for example, if you've been diagnosed with diabetes and you're not able to sort of stay away from sweets, well, that's, that then becomes sort of an unhealthy habit. And then, of course, the hallmark of unhealthy eating habits is unmanaged weight, and that's something that we're going to talk about tonight. So just a little bit of information. In Hawaii, it's estimated that 33% of adults are overweight, meaning that they have a BMI between 25 and 30. And an estimated 23% of adults are actually obese with a BMI of 30 or more. And so when we start to look, if we compare it to the national statistics, we're actually a little bit better than, some other states out there. But nationally, if we sort of combine overweight and obesity together, we start to see that number creeps up to about 70% of the population. And that's pretty scary because there are a lot of consequences that are affected or that are associated with being overweight or obese. Things like heart disease, diabetes. There's a new term that's being coined these days called diabesity, which is sort of the correlation between diabetes and being overweight. Some cancers are influenced by unmanaged weight. And then, of course, over time, even if you don't have these other ailments, can you hear me now? Over time, if you are carrying extra weight, it's going to wear on your joints and affect your ability to be active. And that's going to be sort of a cycle effect on not being able to manage your weight. So those are just, some of the reasons why managing our weight is the stakes are high and it's very important. So when we think about managing weight, most everybody starts to think about diets and, okay, what can I do to sort of quickly lose weight? And so diets in itself can be an unhealthy cycle because we start off very motivated to do these behaviors. And so we exert a lot of effort and, there's a lot of restriction and you might even have some weight loss during this period. But it may not always be healthy weight loss because ideally we want to lose fat and not muscle. And when we start to do really restrictive eating habits, then the opposite can happen where we're losing more muscle than fat. And so inevitably, when you're really restrictive, you're going to get fatigue. People get tired of trying to follow the same sort of diet, and there's going to be rebound eating, and that's when we see that weight increases. Similarly, if you're using products like meal replacements or supplements, these are things that once you stop doing, you're probably going to regain weight. And that's the detrimental part because there's a consequence to that. Not only are you sort of undermining your confidence to be able to manage your weight, but you can also be affecting your metabolism in an adverse way because when you restrict calories for an extended period of time, it can start to affect how many calories you burn at rest. And that's going to, again, in turn, make it harder to lose weight. So these are the reasons why we think that, the dieting itself is really not the way to lose weight. It has to be something more in terms of a durable lifestyle change. And just so that you understand sort of the context of this whole idea of dieting, kind of looked up some of the numbers, and it was estimated by the NIH that U.S. consumers spend about $25 billion per year on weight loss supplements. This is not vitamin supplements. These are weight loss supplements that are often untested and unregulated. So it's a big industry and it really speaks to the problem that we're starting to see with, weight management. The biggest takeaway that we hope you have tonight is the idea that, it really does take lifestyle changes. There's no quick fix to managing weight. Okay, so aside from the dieting cycle, there's an even more sinister cycle that can exist, and it really does stack the deck against us in terms of our battle for weight management. You know, like I mentioned earlier, we live in a day and age where fast food choices are readily abundant, and so are foods that are heavy in sugar, salts, fats. And research is showing us now that this connection between sugars and fats really does trigger the brain chemicals in a way that's very parallel to the cycle of addiction. So what that means is, you know, the more we expose ourselves to it, the higher the threshold becomes of what it takes to be satiated. And that in turn sort of, you know, you've heard that if you eat a lot of sugar, you're going to crave a lot of sugar. And there's some rationale to that. So, you know, not only do we respond to the experience of eating these foods, we actually react to just the stimuli of these foods. And so here's an example. I think we can all sort of look at these, you know, these pictures, and we can anticipate the salty crunch of the chips. We know that sweet taste and that burning sensation of the soda, the first sip of soda going down. So we just seeing the stimuli already starts sort of the brain chemical reactions. And there's a lot of research that goes into making these snack foods very appealing. And that's a whole nother lecture about sort of the junk food industry. But a lot of effort goes into making these foods very appealing so that you will come back and continue to have these choices. So, so in addition to the challenge of choosing healthy food options, there are also other variables that contribute to, you know, that can affect our eating habits. So access to nutritious and affordable foods, that's definitely one of them. Studies have shown that inadequate sleep can affect parts of the brain that are associated with the reward circuit, but also executive functioning. So what that means is, you know, when you don't get enough sleep, you could actually be at risk for craving more high-calorie foods and having less impulse control. And so over time, you can kind of see how that cycle would contribute to weight gain. And that's a really big concern. So sleep has become an area of focus that we work with our folks. Other variables include medical conditions and medications. Sometimes people will be on particular medications that are going to affect their appetite. And so that's something that can contribute to weight management. And then, of course, lastly, mood disorders. Oftentimes, people don't think about mood disorders as something that would impact your ability to manage weight, but it really does. And we see that all the time with the folks that we work with. Certain mood disorders can really undermine impulse control, while others can just make it very difficult to raise the motivation for self-care. So unaddressed mood disorders can be another issue. So to review, there's quite a variety of factors that influence our eating habits. It's not just about willpower like people would have you believe. And because of that, there's not really a single approach that would be universally helpful to all people. And what we've sort of emphasized so far is that diets and quick fixes really are temporary, and they actually have potential to do some harm. And so when we think about managing weight, it really does come down to making sustainable changes that you can maintain for the long term. So I've just done a good job of making the argument that there's no one thing that we can do to manage weight. But there are some concepts that can help to sort of support a healthy and balanced lifestyle, which then in turn can help us all manage our weight a little bit better. So the first thing is, you know, is the concept of mindfulness. And mindfulness just simply means to pay attention and to be aware. So being attuned to our physical bodies, that's one of the first steps, you know, recognizing when we're actually hungry, when we're feeling tired, the cues of satiety. Sometimes that's, you know, we think that's an automatic thing, but that's not necessarily true. Sometimes it takes a lot of attention to really focus on what you're feeling. And also being connected to the idea that, you know, the choices that you make today they're going to affect your health tomorrow. So it's mindfulness with your body is really connecting your actions with, you know, with the care of your health. So when we think about making mindful decisions, what we're asking folks to do is really to recognize the difference between a need and a want, right? And that's something that we sort of try to teach the younger generation. Is that something that you need, or is that something that you want? It also applies to taking care of our health. And then, of course, identifying habits. And so many times we have habits that are developed over time, and it becomes like autopilot. So for example, after dinner, I like to have something sweet, so that has become the habit. I'll have a cookie after dinner. Well, if you're mindful about your decision and you know that you want to protect your health, and perhaps you're working on either weight loss or weight management, then having a cookie every day is probably not aligned with that goal. So identifying those habits gives you an opportunity to make a mindful or conscious choice to pick something else that might be more aligned with your goal. So instead of having a cookie, maybe I'm going to take time to go outside and walk around for 15 minutes, or go do another activity that is more aligned with my desire for weight loss. And then, of course, the mindful attitude. A mindful attitude is probably, is a very important part of mindfulness, because there's a saying that goes, pain is inevitable, but suffering is optional, right? And so it comes down to your attitude. And we all have people in our lives that we know from example. They kind of focus on the negative things. They sort of perseverate on the things that they wish could be, or the things that are not right. And it's really easy to get stuck into that negative loop, but it's also not helpful in achieving your goals. So being mindful means to pay attention of what you do have to be thankful for, because if you can connect to the things that you are grateful for, then gratitude always becomes an option and a different way of looking at things. So your attitude can be a key part of your success. And then we start to talk about the idea of building resilience. And so, resilience comes in different forms. And really, when you think about resilience, it's what are the factors that will help you to overcome and to bounce back and to continue on. And so the first thing that we look at is emotional intelligence. And that just means being aware of your emotions and trying to figure out what's the cause for the emotion that I'm feeling, my emotional state at this moment. And trying to be reflective of that process. It also means finding healthy ways to deal with those emotions. So not just holding them in and harboring or letting things build up and until it gets pent up. It's finding a way to process it, whether it's talking to someone, or if that's not possible, then finding another outlet like journaling or writing about it. Those are important steps to take to manage your emotions. The second part of resilience is maintaining a self-care routine. So that means taking the time to do the things that are important to you, that make you feel balanced as a human being. Spending time with your family, pursuing interests that you've had, developing yourself in all ways, intellectually, spiritually, that sort of thing. Self-care is not something that you can sort of access in crisis. It's something that you have to build into your life. You need to carve time out of your life to develop it, because by the time crisis comes around, it's a little bit too late. So you want to already have those sort of ability or those skills to take care of yourself already set in place. So a self-care routine is really important. And so my most favorite part about resilience is, this idea of flexibility. And I really do think it's a key in the pillar of resilience, because in my line of work, I run into a lot of people who have very rigid thinking styles. And so when we talk about rigidity, we talk about all or nothing, black or white. It's perfect or it's not. I did terrible today. The whole day's done. I'm just going to trash it and eat whatever I want. That all or nothing thinking can be really harmful and really doesn't serve a purpose. And so we encourage folks to really think about flexibility. And so part of that flexibility is setting some realistic goals and then breaking it down into incremental steps that you can achieve. By doing this, you have a better chance at achieving your big goal. But along the way, the little victories that you make, instead of saying, I want to be, I got to lose 30 pounds. Okay, that's a good overarching goal. But a better way to look at it is, okay, over the next 2 weeks, I'd like to lose 1 to 2 pounds. And how I'm going to do that is by breaking down the steps, right? And as you progress and you have these little victories, that builds your confidence and your ability to make the change. And so setting realistic goals is a really important way. And you need to have some flexibility and not just think it has to be 30 pounds or not, it's not good at all. So that's one way. We always talk about progress over perfection. You know, sometimes people like to say, well, I have plans. I'm going to go to the gym. I'm going to have this perfect workout. I'm going to do 90 minutes of cardio, and it's going to be great. This is how I'm going to lose weight. That's a good plan. That's great. Unfortunately, there's going to be days where you don't have 90 minutes to carve out of your schedule, or it's bad weather, or you don't have access to a car. And so we always talk about progress over perfection. So do the things that you can do now. Make a better choice. You know, if you did not so good at lunch, make a better choice for dinner. If you don't have time for a 90-minute workout, go do a 15-minute walk on your lunch break, or, you know, take some time to get outside in the evenings. Those sorts of things go a long way in terms of, you know, reaching your bigger goals. Flexibility also includes the ability to tolerate discomfort, and that's a big one because I think we tend to see a lot of unhealthy behaviors are efforts to avoid feelings that we don't, or states that we don't want to be in. And so it's really important to learn how to tolerate and how to sit through some very uncomfortable things, and that could be negative emotions. It could be a craving for a chocolate chip cookie, because there's a saying, right? You know, all things good and bad come to an end. Same thing with these, you know, painful, negative, uncomfortable emotions. They do come to an end. They don't last forever. So if you can be sort of brave enough to sit it out and allow yourself to feel the discomfort, you're going to find that you get better at doing it. It gets easier. And then, of course, the last thing that I always try to encourage folks to remember is that there's many ways to get to your goal. There is a psychologist that has she gives us a talk. Her name is Sylvia Borstein, and she gives a talk about the value of using a GPS system and that we can learn from the GPS system. Because when you make a wrong turn using a GPS, there's no judgment. Oh, you blew it, you made the wrong turn, you're never going to get there. GPS doesn't do that to you. It just says recalculating to, you know, to the next way to get to your destination. And I think that's something that we can all use in terms of maintaining our motivation, knowing that it's not going to be perfect. You know, we eat on a spectrum. Sometimes we're on the healthy side, sometimes coming through the holidays, we're on the unhealthy side. But the point is to keep trying and to keep finding the ways to make gradual changes, knowing that, you know, sometimes better is good enough, right? It doesn't have to be perfect. So that's sort of the last thing that I like to leave folks with. So now I'm going to turn it over to Connie, who's going to talk about the nitty-gritties.
Good evening, everybody. Thank you, Lisa, for having us speak today. Though I'm going to shift gears a little bit to talk about hunger, I did want to take a moment to mention that a lot of the themes and topics that we talk about do overlap a lot with what Dr. Sato just mentioned. I guess I'll take aside to mention that I guess a personal joy that I have about working with the clinic is that it's allowed me not to work solely in a silo just talking about food and nutrition. It allows me to better understand the psychological challenges that people have or the medical challenges that people have. And I think ultimately it allows us to better help the people who come to see us for their health. So some of the things we'll be talking about, they kind of overlap. So the different types of hunger, just a show of hands, it's about 6 o'clock. Is anybody feeling any hunger at this moment? A little bit. I'm feeling butterflies in my stomach. So once those settle, I think the hunger's going to come about. So let's kind of get into more of what that is like. So similarly to Dr. Sato, I'll take some time just to define some terms. So hunger, really, what is it? So physical hunger is a physical drive to eat. It's often viewed in a negative way, but I kind of see hunger as a protective feature that we've developed over time. It's similar to pain in that, for example, pain is there to let us know that, hey, something's not right. So similarly, hunger is there to tell us or to keep us from starving and to remind us to feed and fuel our bodies. So generally, it's eating for energy and nutrition. It's because we've kind of evolved to have this as a protective feature. It's a very complex process, so I'm trying not to oversimplify it, but things that influence it, circulating hormones, insulin, ghrelin, leptin, all these things that we're still studying and trying to figure out, but that would be hunger in itself. And then there is appetite, or sometimes we truly just use the word mental hunger. So this is what Dr. Sato was mentioned earlier about the hunger that goes on in your brain. So this is more eating for pleasure, for reward, and as she mentioned, it's influenced by our surroundings, who we're with, what's going on in our day-to-day stress, emotions, things like that. So generally, this is just, again, a very simplified look at our eating cycle. So again, if anybody's feeling the hunger right now, we're maybe about right over here. But we go through this cycle constantly throughout the day. So it starts with, we'll start right over here. So needing to eat. Hunger tells you to start eating, so you eat. And then satiation is signals that tells you, okay, I'm getting full, I need to stop eating. And then after you've finished, in between your meals, then you have satiety. So satiety prolongs the hunger until you start getting hungry again, and then the cycle repeats itself. So signs of physical hunger, we all experience it in some way, shape, or form, but common symptoms would be just an actual growling sound. When you hear me talk about food in a second, maybe some of you will experience this hunger pang. Some people, they experience it with just not being very energetic or kind of running out of steam at about 3 or 4 in the afternoon. And then there's this new term called hangry, or just being irritable. Has anybody heard of the term hangry before? Seeing head nods. Anybody get hangry sometimes? Yep, me too. So hangry, it's kind of a combination of, yes, being hungry, and then it turns into just being really upset. And then if hunger gets really bad, blood sugars start running very low, then you'll have the dizziness, the shakes, headaches. So physical hunger is a bit more predictable. It tends to occur about every 3 to 4 hours, and certainly that's different person to person, but this also aligns with the rise and fall in our blood sugars and hormones that I mentioned earlier, but that would be signs of physical hunger. And so then mental hunger, so this one, the distinct difference is that there tends to be some kind of triggering factor. So we'll start with sensory. So this is if your coworker has a candy dish on her desk and you just had lunch, but you see it sitting on the desk, and it kind of, then there's that almost automatic action to just kind of grab a piece. Smell, if you walk into a bakery, walk by a bakery, and that smell of baked goods really gets you. Norms and expectations. So we see a lot of this here. So an example of that would be the Clean Plate Club. Is anybody a member of the Clean Plate Club? Or yes, no. I feel like I was raised with this, that I wasn't allowed to leave my dinner table unless I could finish my plate. And so I was that child who would sit at the dinner table for 2-3 hours, pushing the food around my plate because, I'm stubborn. I don't know, didn't want to finish it, but that was an expectation that my parents had, that you got to finish your plate. Other expectations might be if we go to an all-you-can-eat buffet and there's this expectation that, okay, I just splashed 40, 50 bucks worth, I gotta get my money's worth. So, you'll be on your third, fourth plate of snow crab legs and you're stuffed, but you need to get your money's worth. So that would be another expectation that we have, or a norm that's expected of us. Let's see, going on then, it would be increased stress or emotions. So an example would be if you've had a particularly rough day, you come home, you just want to unwind, and sometimes that unwinding can turn into opening the bag of chips, looking in the pantry, whatever's on the counter, and that's kind of part of the stress release, the unwind process. And so going back to, I guess, defining mental hunger, it would be also craving for very specific foods. I guess how this contrasts to physical hunger is when you are physically hungry, you'll eat just about anything. It might not be your favorite food, but again, you need energy, so anything starts to look good. But for mental hunger, there's tends to be kind of a type of food that people tend to crave, whether it be sweets, give them a little pick-me-up, salty, crunchy stuff, French fries, or maybe even both. French fries dipped in ice cream, things like that, or comfort foods, hot dogs, corn chowder, things like that. So it's for very specific things. And then another distinction is that there's no correlation with time. There's something called the dessert effect, where after you've finished the meal at the restaurant brings over the dessert menu, or they, worse even, bring over a tray of the desserts, and suddenly you have your second stomach, your second wind, and you can go for that dessert even though you're physically full. So not correlated with time at all. So why is this important? Why do I need to know? Well, if your goals are to manage your weight, control your weight, it's very difficult to follow a diet when you're hungry. I think that's one of the flaws that a lot of popular diets have, is they tend to be too restrictive, too calorically restricted. And so then this hunger starts to build and build and build, and that's when people feel the desire to so-called cheat or kind of fall off. Other kind of reasons of why it's important is if you are trying to clean up your diet, trim your calories, and you're having a mental hunger, well, then it's, of course, very difficult to kind of know where your calories are coming from if you're choosing certain foods to kind of soothe other reasons. So I like to bring up what's called the hunger scale. And it goes from a scale of 1 to 10, and 1 being like you're starved, you could eat a horse, and 10 is so full you feel sick. This is Thanksgiving dinner, and we like to encourage a balance of somewhere right in the middle, in between 4 to 5 or 4 to 7. So what I often encourage my patients to think about, maybe right before they're eating, or even just truthfully throughout the days, think, where am I at in my hunger scale? And trying to stay somewhere in the balance, somewhere in the middle, be between a 4 and a 7. Because once you get into the 1s or 2s or 9s to 10s, it's just either you've overdone it already, or at the 1 or 2s, it's very, very difficult to control. You have that animal part of your brain kind of taking over. So, we went a bit too fast. So what can you do? Strategies to manage that physical hunger. The first one that I often talk about is eating on some kind of schedule. This gets a little bit controversial. I often hear people say, I wake up, I'm not hungry, I don't want to eat breakfast. Or conversely, they have an idea that I shouldn't eat after 5 o'clock, 6 o'clock, and so on. The best thing I can say is find a schedule that best fits for what works for you, but ideally try to eat within hour and a half after you wake up, and then every 3 to 4 hours thereafter. That 3 to 4 hours is important mainly because, again, it's aligning with the natural rise and fall in your blood sugar. So an example would be if you have the luxury of waking up at 7, try to have something to eat by about 8. So breakfast, lunch 12, mid-afternoon snack 3:30, and then dinner by about 6:30. And it doesn't necessarily mean you have to have a full-blown meal. If you are somebody who you wake up, I'm not that hungry, just something small. We'll talk a little bit about what, but you don't necessarily, there's no need to have a large meal. Secondly, it would be the idea of planning ahead, being a bit more intentional and organized about your diet. And this one, I think, is where we've seen a lot of the changes in the last several years. You've seen a rise in convenience food, and so our need to plan ahead is not as much of a priority because we have convenient, although unfortunately unhealthy options readily available. So some strategies, or what I mean by planning ahead, would be making it a point to go food shopping regularly, bringing food with you, or packing a home lunch. It's just very difficult to, it's not impossible, but it's very difficult to find appropriate foods when you're out and about. Oftentimes people tend to drive through things that are convenient. And then setting alarms on your phone. This one might be quite annoying, but I hear it often, especially if people are throughout the morning time and afternoon time, if they're very just preoccupied with work or chores or running errands, sometimes the time can just simply escape you. So having that alarm, it doesn't mean drop everything, put something in your mouth, but it's just a subtle reminder that, hey, when you're finished, you got to take care of yourself and find something to eat. So then moving along, we'll talk about the food part of it. So I definitely encourage finding a balanced diet with a focus on foods that are more satiating. Again, satiating to define it is things that will help you to recognize when you're starting to feel full. So research has shown that it's not set in stone always, but it tends to be foods that are commonly high in protein, fiber, and then fluids or hydration. So I'll talk about examples of that, but it's important also to mention then what the things that you would want to limit. Of course, limiting the things that aren't going to keep you very satiated for very long. So again, research has shown that it tends to be kind of a certain category of foods, baked goods, high sugar foods, which as I was watching Dr. Sato's presentation earlier, when she mentioned that fat and sugar are kind of designed to have us want these foods more, well, it's kind of the same thing as these baked goods. So it's kind of cruel in that these things are designed to make you want to eat more of them, but also they're not going to keep you satiated for very long. So they're definitely still doing research into why is it that certain foods don't keep us satiated for very long. My personal theory is that they tend to be so processed to the point that our body doesn't really have to do much work to digest these things. I like to view our digestive system like a muscle, and it's something that we have to use for it to work at its peak. So if we're feeding ourselves with things that don't require a lot of digestion because they've been more processed, well, then they're not going to stay in our system for very long. So going back to point number 3, a balanced diet with foods that are more satiating. For protein, it would be examples of this. There tends to be 3 main categories of protein. You have your animal meats, you have your low-fat dairy, and then plant sources. I encourage a variety of all 3. So some examples of meats would be just one that we love here, fish. So that could be poke, sashimi, baked salmon, chicken, of course, eggs, dairy. I often say in our clinic that cottage cheese is like an unsung hero. It has so much protein to offer, but a lot of people, I think because we didn't grow up with it, we don't really care for it. We kind of look down on it, but it has a lot of protein to offer. And then plants. Plants would be examples like lentils, tofu, soybeans, kidney beans. So those would be proteins. What I would recommend, and of course consult your doctor, but generally trying to prioritize protein with your meals, with your snacks, just to take advantage of its satiating power. So then the next group would be fiber. So fiber tends to come from three main sources. We have our whole fruits, our veggies, and our whole grains. So I tried to also specifically look for the fruits, veggies, and whole grains that provide the most bang for their buck, the most fiber. So the list came out to be things like apples, pears, berries especially was pretty high, not just raspberries, but strawberries, blackberries. For veggies, I don't think anybody can go wrong with veggies. Broccoli, again, came up high on the list. Brussels sprouts, too, choy-sum, and then whole grains. So those would be examples like oatmeal, brown rice, sweet potato, ulu. This category in itself, carbohydrates, whole grains, it tends to be, again, one of those controversial topics. You may have heard people saying, I'm cutting out rice, I'm cutting out my starch, as one of their attempts to try to lose weight. And I often suggest, again, going back to that word of balance. Carbs are not our enemies. We rely on carbohydrates for energy. So of course it's more about choosing the right portion for you, but taking advantage of the ones that have more nutrition to offer. So specifically these whole grains for the fiber that they can provide. And then there are what I coined combinations, superfoods. I think I don't know if there's an actual definition of superfoods, but lately superfoods have come to be things that, provide a lot of antioxidants and a lot of key specific benefits. But for me, my definition of superfoods are foods that, again, provide more bang for your buck. They essentially have more nutrients to offer in a compact single food. So the ones that stood out to me, not just black beans, but really any kind of bean. Lentils are very similar. They're both in the legume category. So nutritionally, you can kind of see they provide carbohydrates, but not only that, a little bit of fat, but protein and fiber. So if you're eating one food that kind of ticks off both the markers of protein and fiber, you bet it's going to be a bit more satiating. Other kind of foods would be then avocado. So you can kind of see there it is predominantly fat, a little bit of carbohydrate, and quite a bit of fiber as well. And then almonds, a quarter cup worth. Again, there's the fat, but it has a nice kind of amount of both carbohydrate, protein, and even fiber. So those are the things that really stood out to me in terms of being kind of a almost all-in-one type of food item. So if you fit in those types of satiating foods, protein, fiber, maybe even some of those combo foods, what are the things that you can consider to manage your physical hunger? You've all probably heard of this one, but drinking enough water throughout the day. Everybody's needs are a little bit different, but making sure you are hydrated is important. And in addition to that, water, it takes up space in our bellies. So if we are sipping on water throughout the day, you're never really allowing that belly to get empty. The sixth one, eating slowly, chewing your food thoroughly. This one, again, I think I was lectured by my mom how it's important to, again, take my time, chew really well. I feel like that's kind of ingrained in a lot of us culturally. But research supports this. We're still trying to figure out why, but research shows that when you are chewing your food really thoroughly, I think in one study it was like 40 chews per bite, which I think is a lot, but it will reduce your hunger hormones, so you're a bit more satiated afterwards. So Mom was right, it's true. If you eat your food slowly, it will help with digestion. And then lastly, practicing food logging. This is one that I get a lot of grief for in our clinic, keeping a food log. We do ask our patients to keep a food log. Selfishly, it's for me to know what's going on, but I feel like it has a huge value for the patient. If you are writing down your foods or logging your foods, you're automatically going to be more aware of what's going in your system. I think sometimes we can think we know what we're eating, but I hear it so many times where people are just almost shocked of what they're actually putting in their mouth when they are having to write it down or log it. So there are a lot of tools nowadays. In our practice, we like to use MyFitnessPal. It's an online tool. There's a website as well as an app associated with it. What's wonderful about it is it has quite a broad database of food choices. And so when you're wanting to go log lunch, for example, you search for the food item, and yes, it even has local foods, Zippy's, L&L, they're all in there. But log it in, and not only is it going to tell you the caloric information, it will also tell you the information about protein, carbs, fat, fiber, so that you can see, am I getting enough fiber? Am I getting enough protein to I'm taking the most advantage of my food for the satiation. With these apps, they give you a caloric goal that is based off of a calculation, and sometimes that works, sometimes it doesn't. So what we offer in our clinic is called a resting metabolic rate, which is a breathing test, allows us to get a much more individual specific result. But going off of the calculations in the app isn't a bad place to start. Other kind of tips for food logging is just logging as you go. I think a lot of us can't remember what we had to eat for dinner or lunch yesterday, so try not to procrastinate it, log it as you go. I've heard other strategies, people will take, we always have our phone with us, they'll take a picture of what they ate to kind of remind themselves later, they'll scribble it on a post-it note, but those are some strategies. So overall, we certainly hope that this talk has enlightened you all about the psychology of eating. I hope that you found it you were able to take away something from it. And thank you for your time.
Thank you. And now I'm going to have the two speakers go up on stage and sit at the table where they can answer your questions for the Q&A portion. If you have any questions, please raise your hand.
Is it on? Is it on? Okay. I don't have a question, but I noticed that you have food logging. Now, I believe in weighing myself every morning. See, I'm 87 years old, and I kept my weight the same throughout my life. In fact, maybe no more than 10 pounds heavier, 5 pounds heavier when I got out of the Army. A scale is just as important as a speedometer in a car. If you don't have a speedometer in your car, what happens? You go beyond your speed limit. The same goes with your weight. If you don't weigh yourself every day and log it in, see, I log my weight down. I log it. 5 columns. The day, the date, the time, which is in the morning, and the weight. And then the 5th column, a little wider, comment if I gain any weight. Now, I've been doing that for over 25 years. Prior to that, I never logged in. But I noticed when I logged in, I know where I'm going. Because you can gain weight slowly, but if you don't have a scale, you're going to find yourself changing pants. Meaning, not really, your trousers going to get bigger. And by that time, you're fighting it. So I think weight management has to do with desire. If you have no desire, where's the motivation? But keeping the scale is a way of motivating yourself. Because if you gain 1 pound, they say, okay, I think I'll try to keep it balanced. And so anyway, I don't want to take any much of your time, but I took a long time in my life to realize that health is very important. And of course, I've always been healthy because I am aware of it. But thank you very much for your time. I don't want to take up your time.
Thank you for that.
Is it on?
So
What-
if I could, I'm sorry, come back to you in a second, but if I could just kind of respond to your comments, that's weighing yourself every day is self-monitoring. And we know not just from observation with patients, we know from research that self-monitoring works. Because why? Because it keeps you from being an ostrich and it keeps you sort of accountable for the actions that you do. So it works. Yeah. Good point.
Okay, thank you. We have another question here.
What is the relationship between weight management and vegetarianism? I mean, is there a relationship if you're a vegetarian?
So the question was, what is the relationship between weight management and vegetarianism? My understanding, I guess, if we're looking strictly about, I don't know if I'm going the right direction, but if vegetarianism is the best way to manage weight, I guess with that, if it's a eating pattern that works for you, that's going to be sustainable for you, it can. Things that you'd want to take into consideration is just having a nice balance between all of the macronutrients, your protein, your carbohydrate, which are different in foods that are common in a vegetarian diet. But research generally shows that by and large, all diets work. It's more about choosing the one that's going to be sustainable for you and the one that fits best.
Okay, other questions? Raise your hand. Oh,
Hi, thank you. Hi, Connie. I've done doing your program and I've lost some weight, but I'm kind of like stuck right now. And I was just wondering, I'm reading about ketogenic diets, and I can't understand why 30% of your calories coming from fat makes you lose weight. And in your program, you want to get into ketosis as well, but with low fat, low carb. So why does ketogenic diet work and does it work? Or, I mean, it sounds so much more pleasurable. Like they say one snack is take a piece of cheese and smear butter on it.
So the question was, I guess, just more wondering about the science behind a ketogenic diet. So our bodies, like I mentioned in the presentation, we have a natural preference for energy from carbohydrates. So a ketogenic diet by design is higher in fats. So I guess ideally the science behind what we're trying to trigger is if I guess the diet itself, it's a high fat, kind of moderate protein, but extremely low carbohydrate diet. So if we essentially, instead of encouraging the body to use carbohydrate for energy, rely on fat for energy, the theory is then that the fat cells get used up for the energy instead of relying on carbohydrates. So it's more about shifting the type of energy that our body uses from carbohydrates to fat. So I hope that answers your question.
we have a question right here.
What are your thoughts on T. Colin Campbell's research in the China study where animal protein, and I believe he used casein in his study, that it promotes cancer, heart disease, and diabetes?
So the question, or just, I guess, just generally asking my thoughts about the China study and how diets that are high in animal proteins tend to be associated with diseases like cancer. So absolutely, I think it's worth taking a look at. I think maybe a flaw I see with the China study is that it's taking too narrow of a look at food, at specific nutrients. And I often like to look at, we're not choosing foods specifically for their individual parts. I think there's a bigger part of the diet, the relationship between the animal proteins, the carbohydrates, and the bigger picture, and not, I think it looks a bit too narrow at it. But generally, a diet that's high in fatty animal proteins, yeah, for sure there is an association with health issues. So like I mentioned in the presentation, I think finding a balance, not just getting your proteins from animal sources, but also plant sources, is a good kind of middle ground. Hmm. Mm-hmm. So I guess it was the question was more of a follow-up comment that more, I guess the diagnosis for cancer kind of rises, has risen or is rising with age. I guess unfortunately I can't speak as much about that. The oncology isn't my forte, but I guess my general thoughts, if I'm looking at it just purely from a kind of a scientific point of view, I mean, certainly diet has a role in health conditions. What I would want to take a look at is what other kind of factors are at role. Are there societal factors? Is it strictly animal proteins, or is it the way that these animal proteins are being produced? Those would be things that I would think about.
Okay, other questions? Raise your hand.
Yes. When it comes to vitamins and supplements, is there any correlation between that and one's psychological, physiological changes when it comes to weight loss program? People who do and do not take vitamin supplements.
Okay, so I'm not sure if I got the question. Your question is with the vitamin supplements, does it have an impact on psychological, like your ability to lose weight? Is that what you mean?
As in, do people who take vitamin supplements go about the program differently? And are there any alternate results physically?
Oh, so just regular vitamin supplement?
Yes, yes.
That's a good question. I don't know that we've ever looked at the correlation. I would think that if you are one who's going to be concerned about making sure that you have a balanced diet, including vitamin supplements, you've got a little bit of a leg up because you're paying attention to your health. I don't know that it actually translates to more success. Do you have any other comments on vitamins?
So my comment to that would be, it's, I guess similarly in that we haven't taken a close look at that. To my knowledge, there's not a close relationship to it. I think in large part that because vitamin and mineral supplements aren't regulated, or they're very loosely regulated, so oftentimes the amounts, what's actually in the products, can vary. So I think that's what makes doing study and research over it so difficult.
Other questions?
Thank you.
So you mentioned eating 1 to 1.5 hours after we wake up. What is the reason for that? And what is a quick, easy? Because a lot Monday through Friday, I just need to get going.
So the question was to explain more about why it's suggested that you eat within an hour, hour and a half after waking, and then further providing some kind of convenient examples. So one of the main rationales behind that is you've spent the last 6 to 8 hours overnight not eating. So it's important to feed your body soon after you waking up. If that process is delayed, then that hunger cycle starts to develop kind of even more. So to your best of your ability, just trying to have something in your body to kind of fuel it again. In terms of convenient examples, if I focus specifically on protein, commonly we suggest, patients boiling up a bunch of eggs and then kind of grabbing one with an apple as they get out the door. Container of yogurt with an instant pack of oatmeal. Those are other suggestions. But yeah, focusing on protein would be where I would suggest.
I'd like to ask a question about how does one become involved in the comprehensive weight management program? How does one participate in that, and who is eligible and who isn't?
So I'll take that question. The question was, how does one become involved with the comprehensive weight program? And since Connie's been so busy, so it's really simple. You can call into our clinic, and we have a sort of screening process that they'll ask you some questions. We have, different parts of our program, and so when you talk to our coordinator, her name is Star, you'll get some good information about the different options and the steps necessary to enter, depending on what program you want to come into. Mm-hmm.
Other questions? Raise your hand. Okay.
I've heard that for teenagers, if they're monitoring their meals very carefully, that there's an increased chance that they develop an eating disorder. Is that correct?
Okay, so the question is, if teenagers monitor their diets very closely, does that put them at risk for developing an eating disorder? So that's a really complex question. It's a good question. I think that there's a fine balance between paying attention to what you're doing nutritionally, but it depends on the motivation for doing that. If you are for example, if this teenager is involved in sports and they're very, concerned about their energy level and being able to sustain for the sport that they're playing, then it makes a lot of sense for them to be very sort of detailed with their diet. But if this is someone who is really more concerned about their appearance, or even concerned with controlling what they eat for other reasons, then yes, then that becomes sort of you'd want to sort of pay attention to that to see what's the underlying reasons, and if there is, the potential for an eating disorder developing.
We have a question here.
Hi. Just wondering about regular fasting or intermittent fasting. What are your suggestions about that?
So the question is just wondering about the thoughts on intermittent fasting. It's something that's definitely been a topic that's come up quite recently. I think, I guess I don't want to necessarily kind of put it on the umbrella of a fad diet, but again, if it's something that is going to be long-term sustainable is more what I would encourage you to think about. And even under the umbrella of intermittent fasting, there's many definitions of it. In some of the iterations that I've heard of, it's follow a sensible diet for 6 days and kind of fast for then the 7th day. And other examples, it's kind of looking at it by time, like fasting from 7 to 11 and whatnot. So overall, I think if somebody is able to achieve a balanced diet with that and have their hunger managed, and if it's a sustainable long-term, habit, it could kind of help, or it could be something that would work.
Okay, other questions? Raise your hand.
When I get up in the morning, I'm not very hungry. So I normally, because I heard that breakfast is the most important meal of the day, and they tell you, yeah, you have to eat. So I normally, but I'm really, not hungry at all in the morning, and I normally have homework. So I tend to, wake up and then I drink like a kitty cup of milk, and that kind of actually makes me feel full. Does that count if I feel full?
So the question was, if I'm not very hungry in the morning and I drink a cup or a glass of milk, is that okay, or is that a good idea? Certainly, a protein or milk has nutrients to offer: protein, carbohydrates. It's one of those nice kind of balanced foods. So if that's something that works for you, and it's providing those good nutrients, certainly, yeah.
I have a question, actually. So last night I came home late after work, and I hadn't eaten dinner, so it's 10:30. I'm wondering, do I eat dinner or do I just go to sleep?
My first question is, what are you doing here at 10 o'clock at night?
I deserve a raise.
Okay. So the question was, if I get home extremely late and I haven't eaten dinner, do I still have something to eat? My answer would be similar to the breakfast kind of comment, in that if you're going to be going to bed shortly thereafter, it's probably not the greatest idea to have a full-blown meal. It can, if you have kind of certain health issues, it's probably not a good idea to lie down right after you eat, but then it can affect your quality of sleep if your body is digesting and you're trying to sleep. So I would suggest the same: have at least something small, something for protein, maybe a little carbohydrate to last you through the night. So if you're looking for specific examples, a slice of turkey, a boiled egg, with a piece of fruit, just something light, just to kind of sit in your belly, so that I guess the risk would be if you went to bed without, well, then you wake up with that extreme hunger, and that's when it's more of a challenge.
Thank you. Other questions? All your food questions answered now? Come on. No? Oh, right.
Thank you. This has been on the psychology of eating, our internal environment, and it's been very helpful. But I think many of us just blame ourselves about our food intake when we don't consider the macro environment. I live in Kailua, and the main artery in Kailua Hills was just, they put in 2 of those wretched roundabouts, which is confusing every driver, and painted lines all over the street, and it's lengthy. There is not one crosswalk, not one. So our government, our own government, is not facilitating the very thing that we need as animals to walk, to move. And we walk our dogs at night, and there are no sidewalks. Absolutely no sidewalks on my street and many of the other streets. It's a death wish to walk in the road. You'd have to dodge cars. So, we blame ourselves, and we don't look outside and see how this is influencing, our choices or our habits. I just wanted to make that comment because I just feel very strongly about that. And there is not enough pressure on local government to do something about the very, very simple things. A sidewalk, a generous sidewalk, so we can get out. Anyway, thank you.
Oh, thank you for sharing. Do you have any response to
So
that?
that's a great comment, and I think that it's a point well taken. I do want to point out that there are some positive changes. I don't know that you've noticed in this area, we now have bike lanes on King Street, and they've just recently extended that up to behind the hospital. And so, yes, I think we have to look at the external factors, but also, I think there's change on the horizon, that there's awareness. But you're right, we really do need to be vocal about making sure we protect our access to activities and such.
Thank you. Does anyone want to share maybe some struggle that they have with weight, or maybe get a tip from the psychologist or the nutritionist? Maybe like, I have this happening to me, what can I best do to combat that? Okay, yay.
I just want to comment about stress eating. My husband has a lot of physical challenges, and when I've come home from a very hectic, very hard day at work that I love, but I'm done now. And then it's like, oh, okay, I have to handle all of this other stuff. I mean, literally, he falls asleep in his motorized wheelchair and over again, to the point last night where his dinner plate fell out of his hand. So I've just sat down and I'm trying to eat my dinner, and I'm caught between totally empathizing with where he is at, and on the other hand, stressed out because I've already expended all the energy I had for the day. And that's when I'll eat, as an example. I'd like take care of the problem, but then I sit down with whatever.
So you bring up one of the main themes that we see with the folks that we work with all the time, which is there are times in our life when the demands on our attention and our energy are very high, and we can't control that. And it's not something that we would sort of shirk either, because these are our loved ones. But it does take balance, because putting your needs, your health needs, and you're prioritizing your health, you could do that for a certain point of, a certain amount of time, but it catches up with you. And that's where we start to see patients really struggle. And so my, suggestion for you would be to find the ways that you can bring some relief. So whether that's, accepting help for respite care, making the time to take for yourself, like we talked about self-care behaviors. It doesn't have to be big, long things. It could be, a few minutes of reading something that makes you feel balanced, or listening to music, or accessing, your faith, or some way of making you feel more balanced. But there's no way around it in the big picture. We always talk about with patients that you need to take care of yourself, right? We always give the example of riding on the airplane and they give you the oxygen mask story, right? If you are with someone who's dependent on you, you cannot put their mask on first. You have to put yours on first so that you can be there to take care of them. So that sort of principle applies. And good luck to you.
Thank you for sharing that. One more over here. Go ahead.
Do you think that government has a role in improving the national diet? For example, do you think that a tax should be levied on sugared drinks?
So the question was, do I think the government has a role in, our national diet? And more specifically, my thoughts about levying a tax on sugary drinks. Certainly, I think there are individual responsibilities and a societal responsibility about our diet itself. The waters get very muddied when you bring businesses and lobbies into the equation. I think the decision makers behind it, scientists behind it, I want to believe that they have the best interests. But I guess to answer your question, absolutely. I think there's a lot more work to be done. I want to believe, I want to be optimistic and hope that things are going in the right direction. We've backpedaled on a lot of things that we have said in the past, and I think we're finding more of a balanced approach to diet itself. To answer your second question about levying a soda tax or a sugar-sweetened beverage tax, if it were up to me, I would want to really look at who would be the ones most affected by this soda tax. And unfortunately, if you think about, people's reasons behind wanting to choose sugar-sweetened beverages, several. For some, it's simply for pleasure. For others, it's kind of where they get their calories from if they're very kind of financially strapped. And so I guess I would be quite torn in terms of, I wouldn't want to be on that decision-making board, but certainly I'd want to think about who is it really impacting, and is it going to get the results that we are hoping to see, which is a reduction in intake of sugar-sweetened beverages. I believe some cities have implemented measures like that. I want to say New York City, for one. I haven't looked closely about their findings yet, but I'd be very curious to see Again, if it were me on that board, I would also want to shore up, okay, if we're going to be taxing the things that people are drinking, what are we doing to also, kind of like you're mentioning, encourage them to then be choosing healthier options? Are we making water more accessible? Are we encouraging healthier behaviors overall?
Thank you. We have a question here.
I'd have something just to share. Recently, we had a friend who had been going through a integrated program. So in addition to the diet, it was really important to be able to exercise, which we all know you should be doing, and also integrate watching your emotional health too. Doing the best you can so that you don't have all kinds of anxieties and angers that will drive you to do that, as well as having a group, it's some group support. But I thought that there was one aspect that was rather interesting because, many people don't realize that all these different type of stressful events and, happen to keep building up. So our threshold, can only go up so high. And so part of this program that they're in right now is, there's one simple rule: when you go home, you cannot watch any news program as long as you're on. No news program. And so I thought, that sort of makes sense because, every evening when I sit down, I make time for that news no matter what. You can get the same news in a newspaper or something else, but, I just noticed though that, you have to grab something because, sometimes some chocolate or, whatever, munchies to get through. So, but anyway, it's just something that you have to be just mindful of it, I think. That, that too is something that adds as a stress. And so if you can get your news, another way until you can get to your goal that way, it just might help. I've been trying
Interesting. That's an interesting comment. So if I could just comment on your comment of a multidiscipline team. So that is actually the philosophy that our program follows. When a patient comes in to see us, they have access not only to the medical guidance of the bariatrician, but access to the knowledge development with dietitian, behavioral health. We're there to help folks, figure out the emotional part and where the challenges are. So I think the multi sort of discipline approach is the way to, because weight is complex. It's not just a medical issue.
Okay, one more question here.
Is the strategy for weight management, it seems to be managing your weight, overweight. Does it apply to people who need to gain weight?
That's a great question. The question was, I guess in our program, do these sort of theories or concepts apply to people who need to gain weight? We haven't had the privilege of working on that. I don't think maybe a handful of patients who have had bariatric surgery that struggle but not because of the effects of the surgery, but for various reasons struggle with maintaining weight. But it certainly is something that I think we're equipped to deal with, if necessary.
I'll chime in a little bit about that from a nutrition perspective. So, like Dr. Sato mentioned, there have been a handful of cases where we've seen patients who, after bariatric surgery, have maybe lost a bit too much. And so if I look at the nutrition reasons why, it's similarly, they're maybe not quite adherent to their frequent meal pattern. They're maybe kind of going the whole day without eating and not taking in enough calories, or they're not necessarily prioritizing or selecting the right food. So I think certainly there can be some overlap between the two. We've had kind of discussion about just generally it's about being aware. So if somebody is, falling into an underweight category and there's no explanation for it, I think first it would start with awareness. So the habit that we mentioned in the presentation about keeping a food log is a good way to see, are they getting in enough calories? And then I think that helps to kind of shine more light on if there's any nutrition reasons going on.
I think there's one last question here.
I just have a question about the ketogenic diet. What effect does it have on cholesterol levels, LDL, HDL, and triglycerides?
So the question was regarding the ketogenic diet. What effects could it have on cholesterol levels, LDL, HDL? To me, I think it can go both ways. I think there can be a way that it can be done where it doesn't affect cholesterol levels as much. I would take a look at kind of the types of fats that are being consumed. Is it plant-based fats? Is it animal-based fats? And kind of going from there. The ketogenic diet isn't necessarily for everyone. For that very reason, there are patients who start a ketogenic diet and then their cholesterol levels are elevated and it's not a sustainable plan for them to continue. I think, based on that, it tends not to be a diet that's recommended in the long term. I believe at most 3 to 6 months. But those would be kind of, I guess the types of fats would be something to take into consideration. Plant-based fats tend to have a lesser effect on elevating the so-called bad cholesterol, so that can have a role.
Okay, thank you for all those questions and answers. Let's give another round of applause for Dr. Ronnie Sato and Connie Wang. I also want to say mahalo to the folks at the Queen's Comprehensive Weight Management Program who was out there with all the information and the brochures. Let's give them a hand too. And your your carrot clip, right, to hold your bag of carrots. Also want to say mahalo to our Queen's volunteers, Marcy Prinz, James Liu, and Anthony Chen, who checked everyone in, and James, who helped me with the microphones this evening. Next month's lecture, February, is American Heart Month, and we have this it's so catchy, the title of this next lecture, High Blood Pressure and the 2017 ACC AHA Guidelines. Okay, for a cardiologist, that sounded super sexy, so that's the title we have. Basically, they have new guidelines. So ACC stands for American College of Cardiology, and AHA is the American Heart Association. And last year in 2017, they came up with these new guidelines. And hearing about them and learning about it might make your high blood pressure or make your blood pressure rise, but that's because of the guidelines themselves. So what happened is they lowered the definition of high blood pressure, and that's going to affect what you might consider high blood pressure. So our doctor, who is Robert Hong, he is a cardiologist. He's also the chief of staff here at Queen's Medical Center. He's going to talk about high blood pressure, also known as hypertension. He's going to talk about why it is a problem, why does it occur, what are these new guidelines, understanding it because there is some controversy around it, and what you can do about it. That's coming up February 28th, 6 to 7 p.m. right here at the Queen's Conference Center. And if you want to register, you can go to queens.org and click on Attend a Class, or just call our Queen's referral line at 691-7117. That is going to do it for us this evening. Thank you so much for joining us. Make sure you get your tickets validated out front, and have a good evening. Good night.